Hello all, welcome to the lecture on music and essentially music and violence, but music is used on the battlefield, as in torture interrogations, and also music as a deterrent for undesirable behaviors and deterrent for a specific class of people, namely young people causing trouble around the cities. I will talk about each one of these in turn, and I'll give a slight detour also onto the use of sound also as kind of a weapon. And this will be in complement to our lecture for Wednesday, which is about music and its uses in movements advocating peace. So let's get started. Music has a long history in the use of in war, really, and we can think back of, we've talked about the Janissaries, the Turkish military bands that were so impactful, at least on the European consciousness, that they had the Janissary type or Turkish type music was then emulated in European classical music and opera. But really, music has been used all for as long really as there has been war. Drums and bugles and that kind of thing have always been a part of the soldiers or an army's equipment. I think one of the kind of more fascinating instances of music, and specifically one type of musical instrument used in war and its classification, is the bagpipes. And if you look at the bagpipes used in Scottish military history, it's got a long history of being used to kind of signal troop movements, to kind of terrify the opposite side with kind of these crazy sounding bagpipe tunes, and also to rile up the troops, to kind of inspire you to do great things. And there's lots of instances, there's examples of bagpipes being used in this way. Interestingly, the bagpipes were classified as a weapon of war for really 200 plus years. And really what the theory behind that was that that Scottish troops would never go into war without a bagpipe leading them into it. And so this was actually in 1745. There was a battle of Culloden in Scotland, and the bagpiper, this guy named James Reed, was captured and brought to England. And then these English judges ruled that even though he didn't have a weapon on him, he only had his bagpipes. That they, because of their very central use to the kind of Scottish regiments, movements and tactics, etc., that the bagpipe was classified actually as a weapon. And unfortunately, James Reed was hanged, drawn, and quartered in the very gruesome execution. But that idea that the bagpipes were an actual weapon was kept in English law until really very recently. This is in contrast to things like drums and bugles, which are not classified as weapons. So interestingly, you could be a bagpiper in a Scottish army and be at risk of being executed if you were caught. But if you were a trumpeter or a drummer, you didn't have that same risk to your life. Interestingly, bagpipes are oftentimes used to help lead men over the top of the trenches in World War I. And because of this, actually, bagpipers being unarmed and playing a fairly cumbersome instrument, they were actually an easy target for the enemies in World War I, and they had a very high casualty rate. Around maybe about 1,000 bagpipers died in World War I. But they really kind of demonstrate their use or music's use as to inspire people to go and kind of create great, or attempt great acts of heroism in the face of, especially in World War I, pretty much certain death once you stepped outside of the trenches. From World War I, though, we also have an interesting development, and that is recorded music. And so through World War I, really through Vietnam, music was used, yes, to inspire and entertain the troops, no matter what side they were on. And that was done through radio broadcasts and through phonograph distributions, etc. And many times these the tunes being sung by both sides became so popular with the other side that that those songs were then translated and re-performed for the troops' enjoyment and pleasure. So there's a good example of a German song, Lili Marleen, became super popular with the Allied troops in World War II, and it was translated and re-performed. And so, and that also happened with the German troops, where American and European popular tunes became popular on both sides of the the divisions, line divisions. And we talked about a little bit about also in previous lectures about how music was used to kind of inspire a sense of American duty and kind of wartime duty and civil religious duty. We've talked about that a bit in other lectures. But for the most part, in World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, these music wasn't really used so much as it was in previous centuries, really as either signaling, troop movements with the bagpipes or Turkish Janissary bands playing during the actual combat. And if you could hear the band playing, you knew your side was still winning. So the kind of use of music in the war was not so much a prominent feature, but it was used as propaganda. Oftentimes in World War I and other wars, in World War II, radio stations were cut off, and the only radio station in some parts of the theater of war was music from the other side, and that's one of the reasons why these other songs became popular on both sides of the conflict. And we can't talk about the use of music in war without referencing at least Francis Ford Coppola's iconic Vietnam scene in Apocalypse Now, when you have these helicopters coming in and playing Ride of the Valkyries to kind of terrorize the Viet Cong population. And that was not real. That was a part of fiction, as iconic as it was. It became somewhat more real. We think there's evidence, there's stories of some tank divisions in the Desert Storm War in Iraq, some tank divisions actually doing the same sort of thing, broadcasting the Ride of the Valkyries as they rode towards Baghdad. So it's an interesting way of real life imitating art in a sense. More recently, like I said, outside of propaganda, music hasn't been used in a very direct way, except for we have some other some exceptions to that rule. And in really the one that's always listed in the history books is the Operation Just Cause, when the Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega kind of holed up in the Vatican City diplomatic mission in Panama, and U.S. troops really set siege to that building, and part of their siege was playing tons of different types of music, but rock music, American rock music, and blasting it at super loud volumes until actually Noriega surrendered. That was one of the uses of music as kind of as a tool of war, really. We have other examples of that similar types of things. So there's an example from the Korean DMZ, the demilitarized zone between North Korea and South Korea. And after the sinking of the South Korean battleship, as payback for that, South Korea blasted the demilitarized zone in North Korea with this K-pop's group's "Huh" or "Hit Your Heart" by the K-pop group Word 4 Minute. Actually blasted it for so long that the North Koreans threatened to turn South Korea into a sea of fire because of the blasting of this music across the DMZ. Other examples you have, I think interesting examples of the UK's Royal Navy's use of Britney Spears and broadcasting that at a very loud volume to ward off Somali pirates in their activities around the Horn of Africa. So this is just good examples of the use of music as kind of a tool in war and or a tool in deterrence of different types, not only kind of as a way of pressuring people to give up, as in Noriega's case, or kind of as payback in the Korean DMZ case, or as kind of a sonic ward in the Somali pirate case. And so I just wanted to give you a couple examples of these types of music being used in war. And so I've embedded a couple of videos below this lecture. You can take a minute to listen to 4 minutes the K-pop band's music, and this was the one that was broadcast across the DMZ by South Korea. I also put up Britney Spears' "Oops, I Did It Again," and if you truly are wanting to hear the full full tragedies of war or the kind of the reasons why the Somali pirates generally turned away and fled, I'd advocate you can listen to the Britney Spears example. I think it's a really interesting use of music as a deterrent, and the second example is certainly that. And so this idea of music as a deterrent for behaviors and for certain people really has a pretty well documented use in America and in the UK. Classical music has been used for at least decades as a deterrent to kind of youth hanging out, loitering, graffitiing and trashing places. And really, it started off actually in Canada, where in Montreal in the 1990s, there was an experiment that was carried out, and then there was classical music being played, broadcast, and it kind of drove the younger groups of people away. It was also tested in England and the UK metro system, the tube system in 1997, and also was found extremely effective. And so there was actually a subway tube stop in the UK that was so dangerous the train drivers didn't even want to stop there. And after they started piping in classical music and playing it at these train stops, robberies were cut by 33%, assaults on the staff were down 25%, and vandalism was down 37%. And so really you have kind of the idea of Mozart or Vivaldi or Pavarotti reducing crime just by their mere sonic presence. This was used in the UK and Canada, and was also starting to be used in the US, really around the places. And so you have places like Burger King and McDonald's playing classical music outside their establishments to try and keep groups of kids not, hanging about. It's not always 100% effective. There have been instances where the speakers broadcasting classical music were actually destroyed by youth gangs, etc. And so it's not 100% effective in deterring crime, but for the most part, actually, it's been remarkably effective at deterring and at least making people move on rather than loitering around and causing trouble. So I think these examples from the UK and Canada and the US really raise some interesting issues, or some interesting things about music and its use as a marker of space, and a way as really music is signaling inclusion and exclusion for different groups of people. So really for the teens or the young people who are unfamiliar with classical music, with Vivaldi and Mozart, etc., the idea is, don't stay here. You're not going to enjoy this. It's kind of makes people, maybe people uncomfortable, makes people just unhappy. They don't want to sit around and chat and eventually maybe cause trouble if there's kind of a classical music in the background. And I think this speaks to a very interesting, or at least a way that classical music is reinforcing hierarchies in society. It's reinforcing age or generational hierarchies. It's also reinforcing class hierarchies. And so you typically have classical music associated with a higher class, older patrons, while as the kind of young people are not generally knowledgeable of or they don't enjoy classical music as much, and so it's used as a deterrent. So in some ways, the use of music as a deterrent is reinforcing these hierarchies. And so we talked about in a previous lecture about how, especially with Alan Lomax, and how he wanted to understand how music reinforces social structure. This is a great example of just that, the use of kind of this quote-unquote elite music to reinforce class structure and generational structure in society, use of music as a deterrent. So again, this is a really interesting way of how music is reinforcing certain things in real life, in real society. There has been some other, at least thought about this idea of why music is a deterrent to kids hanging around and causing trouble. Some of the research has been done that music period and some classical music also causes your brain to release dopamine and puts you in a better mood, makes you a little bit happier, and they're therefore less likely to commit crimes and or get in fights or destroy things, etc. I'm not sure that may have a small amount to do with it. I don't know. There's not definitive studies on this, but I think that might play into music as a deterrent. But I really think it's much more about setting a scene, kind of marking a space out that isn't necessarily comfortable for, or at least conducive to hanging out, if for young people to hang out, or young kind of, you know, miscreants, if whatever you want to call them. So really, it's more, I think, of music as creating this uncomfortable space that people want to they don't want to necessarily stay in. They'll move outside of. The next thing I wanted to remark on, though, is that in these deterrent music, the use of music as a deterrent, in these examples, the choice of music is not incidental. It's actually directly playing on the differences, the kind of the class differences, the age differences. It's directly playing on notions of masculinity and effeminacy, etc. So the choice of music in these deterrent examples is very important, and that if we later on in the lecture, we'll come to the idea that music, the choice of music, may not actually be important in the kind of music and torture examples, but certainly in these deterrence examples, the choice of music is vitally important to get the desired effect, that is driving people away, driving young people away, really. So in addition to Britney Spears driving off Somali pirates and classical music driving off anyone under the age of 20, 23, 25, whatever it is, I wanted to talk a little bit about the use of sound as a deterrent for a certain class of people. And this is the idea of the kind of high frequency anti-loitering devices, also called the Mosquito. That's the brand name. And these are places, so instead of just having classical music maybe driving off young people loitering, you also have some people installing these types of high frequency speakers at locations where young people would congregate. And what these speakers do is broadcast a very high pitched frequency, so the kind of upper end of the human hearing range, and it generally will drive off younger people specifically. And this will happen, if you remember, in our lecture several lectures ago where we talked about human hearing range. Humans normally can hear something, generally it's thought of as 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So there's a big, that's what we can typically hear, although in lab conditions we can hear a little bit outside of that range. So as you approach the kind of upper limit of human hearing, that 20 kilohertz, you get really high-pitched kind of squeaking or scratchy type sounds. And as I mentioned before as well, as you get older, that the ability to hear those frequencies, it diminishes. And so really after 25 or 20, around there, younger, you actually, when you get older than 25, you really can't hear these super high frequency sounds. So these anti-loitering devices are specifically targeting young people, teenagers, etc. The Mosquito device itself actually broadcasts typically a tone around 17.5 kilohertz, and it really is this high-pitched whining frequency that most adults will go around and not be able to hear it, while as the teenagers, it will drive them absolutely bonkers. So I have listed below this lecture another website example. There's a tone generator website, and I want you to just go there, take a little visit there. Make sure you have your speakers. Hopefully your speakers can actually play sounds of this kind of high pitch frequency. Or your headphones, but again, go to the website, experiment with the tone generator, and see where your hearing cutoff is. Again, make sure your speakers or your headphones can actually broadcast or play that. So if you're using maybe little earbuds, they may not be able to broadcast the super high frequency sounds. Get the best quality speakers or headphones you can, and play with that. Again, be very careful, lower the volume because it can be extremely loud. It's just a sine wave generator, and experiment with where your hearing range cuts off. And I'm assuming probably most of you will be able to hear the 17.5 kilohertz frequency that the Mosquito device broadcasts. I can hear it a little bit, but certainly at 17.5 is just at the edge of my hearing. If I go any higher to 18 or 19 kilohertz, I can just barely hear a little squeaky sound, but it basically blends into the tinnitus in my ear. So yeah, experiment with what you can hear, assuming that your headphones and speakers can actually broadcast those high frequencies, and see where your cutoff threshold is, and see this is a factor of age, is also a factor of hearing damage, and so if you have any hearing damage at all, you'll have a lower threshold for your hearing. So again, yeah, pause the video, take a look at that website, and then come back. And so since we've been talking about music and or sound as deterrents, I thought we should at least address the kind of military uses of music and sound, especially different frequencies, etc. So there's really a strong not only tradition but a strong research underway in the military to find non-lethal weapons and or technologies that can broadcast sound, make people uncomfortable, drive away groups of people, etc. And so I thought I'd just introduce a few of those to you. The first one would be this long-range acoustic device, or LRAD, and this is it can emit sounds at a particular frequency and really, or broadcast them through kind of mass notification. And these are used on ships for broadcasting information, long distance to other ships. They're also used by the Army in terms of trying to disperse crowds. They're also used in some cases. The actually police in urban areas use these kind of sonic weapons that'll be not necessarily harmful to your hearing. All that might be a little bit debatable. Not harmful to your hearing, but at least drive people out of the area with sound. There's another type of system being developed called the EPIC system, which is actually getting really, it's more of kind of a focused type of sound beam that it is producing kind of mechanical transduction in your ear, actually, and nerve cells to kind of make you hear things that are not necessarily broadcast to the entire area or room, but more focused. So there's, again, these different types of weapons that are being used to broadcast information or sound, or also maybe disorienting people, confusing people, causing extreme motion sickness, etc. There was some debate in the news. If you recall, there was some talk about diplomats in Cuba and China actually experiencing these maybe some effects of like traumatic brain damage, etc. Then they were confused about what was happening in these instances. There was some thought that there was these covert sonic weapons being used against diplomats. That's kind of unclear exactly what the cause was, but there's a possibility that one of the possibilities was a type of focused sound that is disrupting nerve cells and or your brain cells, basically, that was being used by either the Chinese or the Russians, or we don't really know. That's debatable whether or not that was the case. Some people said it was mass hysteria, but this is kind of the idea that some of these weapons could be used in this covert way that we really have no idea what's going on. And at least in the Cuba case, there was some evidence of brain damage in some of the diplomats. Another weapon being developed is this laser-induced plasma, which is basically a super fast laser, a femtosecond laser that is shot onto something for certain bursts, and it actually can produce sound at the point of where the laser is contacting. So this is, I gave you a video that you can actually also listen to again. This is a sound being produced right where the laser is hitting, it's not being broadcast over speakers, but actually right at where the laser is contacting material. So that's a really interesting way that the military is using, again, trying to use lasers to produce sound to either produce effects in people to drive people away, to give people warning signs, or actually they're working on producing voices. And so this is a really interesting and kind of trippy way of thinking about future warfare. If people have these laser sound devices that can produce sound only to one person, or not broadcast everywhere, can really be very kind of a psychological type weapon. So again, I gave you a little video of that, of this femtosecond laser producing sound on this spinning disc. Watch it. Turn your headphones down. It's pretty loud. And if you listen very carefully, the first example is kind of a alarm type sound being produced by the laser. And the second example, if you look very carefully, you can almost hear words being produced. And they're very close to being able to actually produce speech with these lasers. And so that's a very interesting way of having these plasma fields getting this kind of haunted walkie-talkie type effect that could be used against individuals and people. So pause the lecture, really quick little video on the femtosecond laser you can watch, and different ways that technology is being used to create sound as really a weapon, a non-lethal weapon. And finally, we'll come into the kind of the bulk of the lecture. What we're talking about is the use of music and torture. And this is the article you read, which actually was a presentation at a conference by Suzanne Cusick. She really, I think, is sketching out some of the implications of using music as a form of non-touch torture or non-torture that actually is traumatic and very destructive to a person's subjectivity and will that they'll actually then break and break under questioning. It's again this kind of first sketch because there hasn't been a lot of research and a lot of information about this, but I think it really raises some interesting points. First off, Cusick really discusses the difference between the use of loud sound, and that's really irrespective of the choice of music, and the use of music specifically chosen for its content and style. And so for the most part, what she talks about in references is a lot of what's being used in this kind of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib in Iraq, these kind of uses of music as to break a person's will was really more a function of the loudness. It was super loud all the time whenever you're trying to sleep, and that is just a process of breaking someone down as a way of breaking their subjectivity, breaking their will, and it really had nothing to do with the type of music playing. I think it's also interesting to really look at the other examples. She talks about how music was chosen specifically for the content and the type and style of music being used. So not only is it still going to be loud and disturbing person's sleep, etc., but in interesting uses of particular music and the content and the style of that music in terms of music and torture. And I think Cusick raises a couple of really interesting points that a certain music used in these kind of prison situations, these torture situations, are kind of a manifestation of America's unseen global power. And we've talked about how America is broadcasting a type and style of music all across the world for everyone to listen to. And in these cases, in these very specific cases where music is being used to break down a person's will, this music is an unseen manifestation of America's global power. I thought that was interesting to think about, and you can think about that and ponder that for a little while. It's a maybe interesting and disturbing and or powerful thing to think about. Cusick also discusses how a lot of the music being used in these torture scenarios was chosen because it has this very masculine sounding music. It's this very masculine sounding rap and masculine sounding heavy metal music, and it really is used as a way to make the terrorist or the combatant feel effeminized, or at least having their kind of masculinity be destroyed by this incessant loud heavy metal rap music. And I don't know, I'm not sure I entirely agree with that. At least I'm not sure I can agree with that heavy metal and or rap is necessarily going to challenge a person's masculinity. And I think it's maybe something you should think about. I'll put up a discussion question on the discussion board, and I want you to discuss maybe some of these ideas of the use, especially of the use of music, a gendered type of music, and in its use in torture. And so I wanted to point out, at least for this, the use of gender and masculinity in these music examples in torture, I wanted to discuss a couple things that I think maybe go against Cusick's arguments. I want to point out that heavy metal has had a long history of kind of this androgyny. You think back to like bands like Kiss and other bands in the 80s where they're using lots of makeup and tight and bright clothes and all these other things. So there wasn't necessarily this extreme masculinity stereotype with these musics. There's maybe more of that in some heavy metal bands, but certainly not all. I think it also is important to remember that men and masculine men, or stereotypically, are not necessarily always the fans of this heavy metal music, and so there are women fans, there are LGBTQ fans of this quote unquote masculine genre that maybe dilute the argument that heavy metal and rap are an affront to a combatant or a terrorist's masculinity themselves. I do think it's interesting that Cusick addresses both the kind of online, she calls it blogosphere, or the kind of chat room discussions of music and what types of music would be appropriate for torture, and this kind of emphasis on this kind of very masculine type of music, maybe destroying or a terrorist or a combatant's sense of their own masculinity. I think it's interesting she points that out and also discusses the soldiers' use of the music. I think it really is critical, though, in many of these cases where music has been used in interrogations, is that it was just on the playlist of the soldier, in the room at the time. It wasn't necessarily chosen, searched for, and sought out and chosen. It was what the person was listened to in the first place. I also think it's important to remember that the entire idea that rap and heavy metal automatically exude this uncomplicated masculinity is up for debate. And if you're interested in especially heavy metal and the ideas of power and gender, I'll point you toward a really great book by Robert Walser. It's called Running with the Devil: Power, Gender, and Madness in Heavy Metal Music. And I think he really he kind of dissects the idea, or dissects a lot of these kind of stereotypes we have about heavy metal. I also think it's interesting she brings up the idea how music affects a person's subjectivity or their sense of self. And I think she brings up an interesting point, Cusick does in her article, that if you go to a loud concert or a long session at a rave or whatever, you as just a person going to these concerts as a kind of a fun thing to do, there's a sense of this sensuousness or this kind of even a kind of eroticism, maybe not sexual eroticism, but right down to your bones. If there's music like impacting your brain, your bones, and your body, it's a very powerful feeling. And I think it was interesting that she points this out in terms of the possibility that this very loud music is disturbing to a prisoner's sense of self because of the conflicting notions you have, or humans may have, about music being, as changing our subjective sense of self. So really, she brings up several great things to think about, and I would love to hear your thoughts about them on the discussion board. The idea of music and masculinity being used as in interrogation to break another man's masculinity or sense of self. The idea that music was being used by the U.S. government and interrogators to in a way, it's also reinforcing the kind of otherness of the terrorist and/or combatant, who are maybe not used to listening to rap and heavy metal. These types of music was used because they thought it was alien to their sense of self. That's an interesting thing that she brings up. And also, it's really important to bring up that the idea, it's not necessarily just the music. It could be just the actual sound, disturbing sleep patterns, etc., that is really part of the breaking of a person's will. And so in that respect, I would point you to the use of Barney's The Purple Dinosaurs I Love You song as being one of the more popular songs used to break a person's will. And so in a sense, it's not about masculinity, it's not about the heavy metal or rap, it's about really any music being repeated for days and days on end, an extremely loud volume that can really disturb a person's sense of self. So I think these are all really important things you read about in your article. I think we've talked about several uses of music historically in war as a kind of a tool of war, as a weapon of war. We've discussed music and sound as a deterrent for certain classes and certain groups of people. And we've discussed music in interrogation, music in torture and interrogation, and maybe some of the reasons why music is chosen, and also some of the reasons why the choice of music doesn't really matter. These are all interesting things. And again, this is a brief kind of survey of the use of music and in violence, essentially. There are many other cases we'll discuss in future lectures, kind of use of music by kind of repressive states. So I'm thinking of North Korea and other places, the use of the style of music that's promoted, the use of music as kind of propaganda. We'll talk about that more in the future. And so I want to leave off with, if you truly want to torture yourself, I've listed the Barney I Love You video down below, and that's just click on that only if you have a need for hurting yourself. But yeah, so we'll come back next on Wednesday. I'll have the lecture again, kind of a flip side of this, the use of music in movements towards peace. And I really want to hear your comments about the use of music in interrogation, the use of music as a deterrent, and what this says about our society in terms of reinforcing ideas about class in terms of maybe use of classical music as a deterrent for youth, and also the use of heavy metal and rap music in interrogations and in kind of prolonged torture sessions. So I want to hear both your thoughts or all thoughts about both of those issues on the discussion board, and I would hope we could have a nice, again, respectful discussion. Hopefully you guys can respond to some of your fellow classmates' comments. Thanks very much. We'll see you next lecture.